Hello students, let us now discuss an important essay of literary criticism, tradition and individual talent, written by the poet, playwright and critic T.S. Eliot. Now this is a significant work of literary criticism and one that is often considered as a manifesto of Eliot's poetry. It is an essay that gave a new direction to literary criticism in the 20th century. T.S. Eliot is often considered as one of the most prominent and prolific among the 20th century writers of English literature. He made a mark and contributed in a significant way to English literature as a poet, essayist, publisher, playwright and critic. The years during which Eliot was in the forefront as a writer, from around 1910 to 1939, is often considered as a significant age in English literature, the age that is often known as the age of modernism. It was a period ravaged by war, yet it saw some significant literary works being published, significant literary trends being launched. It is considered as a kind of renaissance in English literature, often compared to the renaissance of the Elizabethan age, the age of Shakespeare, from the end of the 16th to the beginning of the 17th century. The period is also compared to the very prolific age that we know now as the age of Restoration and the neoclassical age, the age of Dryden and Pope and other writers of that period, and also the prolific outpouring of the Romantic age towards the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. So this early period in the 20th century, 1910 to 1940, is compared to those earlier periods of English literature for the sheer number of literary works that were being written and the new trends that were being launched, and a great deal of the credit for this this kind of outpouring and this kind of prolific production in literature and culture is often attributed to T.S. Eliot and the role that he played as a poet and a critic. Eliot often described himself as a classicist in literature, a royalist in politics, and an Anglo-Catholic in religion. This stand that he took, particularly that stand of a classicist in literature, is something that can be evidently seen in one of his most important essays, the one that is prescribed for our study, Tradition and the Individual Talent. Written in the year 1919, it was published in the form of 2 installments initially in a very important journal called The Egoist. Now, The Egoist was a very significant literary journal, Eliot himself had in fact become the editor of this journal in 1917, and it played a very important role in shaping the literary ideas and trends of this period. It saw the publication of most of Eliot's major works, especially the essays, the works of the other major figure of modernism, Ezra Pound. James Joyce, the modernist novel, had his novel uh, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man published serially in this journal. So it was a very powerful journal which influenced literary trends to a great deal. And when this essay came out in 1919, it became an instant hit, and everyone was discussing it, so much so that very soon, in the year 1920, when the publication called The Sacred Wood came out, which was a collection of essays on poetry and criticism written by Eliot, this essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, found a place in it. The essay consists of 3 sections. In the first part, he gives us an insight into tradition. In the second part, he talks about the impersonality of art, and in the third section, he makes a conclusive remark. So in the first section, he talks about tradition, emphasizes the importance of tradition or a sense of history in the field of writing and understanding poetry. In the second part, he talks about the importance of impersonality and how it is important to separate the personality of the writer from the work, from the literary work. So we'll explain these sections in detail in the next class. For the moment, we'll just close this lecture with the understanding that this is a very important essay which would help us to understand the age, or which we today know as the age of modernism, the poetry of Eliot himself, and the ways in which this essay had an impact on literary criticism in the 20th century. The first section of the essay is where Eliot highlights the importance of tradition. He says that we normally have a very conventional idea about the word tradition. We call a person and a person's work traditional when we think of it as rather old-fashioned and outdated. But it is not in this sense that Eliot uses the term. Nor does he use it in the sense of, a tradition to which one should have a blind and almost timid, obedient adherence. On the other hand, tradition for Eliot is something to be understood in a much broader sense. He uses the term tradition to convey a historical sense. And Eliot believes that this historical sense is indispensable to anyone who wishes to be a poet, who wishes to be considered as a poet. Any mature poet should have this historical sense. And this historical sense is a dynamic one. It involves a perception of the pastness of the past and also of its presence. The past as something, a tradition as something that belongs to the past as much as it affects the present. So the historical sense compels a man, says Eliot, to write not merely with his own generations, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer onwards has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. In other words, a writer ought to be aware of his or her presence in that larger order. The fact that he or she belongs to this long tradition of writing. It cannot be just limited to the present age. It involves a continuity with the past. So this historical sense is timeless as well as temporal. It is timeless in the sense that it continues from the past down to the present, and it is also temporal because it's very contemporary. It belongs to the present, even as it belongs to the past. That is why he calls it timeless as well as temporal, and it is timeless and temporal together. So, a person who evaluates a literary work, a critic, therefore, should see a literary work, should evaluate a literary work as something that is beyond time. That is, the critic should evaluate the best work of our time and the best work of some 2,500 years ago with the same eyes. So Eliot, is quick to point out that tradition is not something that looks down upon novelty or originality. A different voice, a new voice. If tradition looks down upon that kind of novelty, that tradition is not what Eliot upholds. He does not have any regard for the kind of tradition that would reject the individuality or the individual effort on the part of a writer. On the other hand, this tradition is something that appreciates the individuality of a writer, even as it considers the writer as belonging to that long tradition or history. So this kind of historical sense is what makes a writer traditional. Highlighting the significance of tradition thereby, Eliot says that the individual poet must always subordinate himself to this tradition, because it is any day, this tradition is any day more important than the poet himself. So it is from this point that Eliot moves to the second part of the essay, where he talks about the depersonalization of the poet. He concludes in the first section that the progress of the artist is a continual self-sacrifice. In other words, a continual extinction of personality. So, Eliot uses the example of a chemical reaction to explain this concept of depersonalization. He says that the mind of the poet is like a receptacle in which various ideas and objects, thoughts, emotions, all of these combine together to create the work of art. And the mind of the poet, he says, is like a catalyst. We know that in a chemical reaction, the catalyst itself remains unchanged. So, when a piece of platinum is introduced into a gas chamber, which contains sulfur and carbon dioxide, these two will combine to form sulfurous acid, but the platinum itself will remain unchanged. The mind of the poet is like this platinum, is like this catalyst. The emotions and feelings are sulfur and carbon dioxide. The more perfect a poet, the less involved will the poet be in his or her own personality. The artist's mind will keep forming new compounds, new works of art, but the artist himself or herself will remain separate in the whole process of creation. That is why he makes that famous statement, the mind that suffers, that is, the mind that experiences a particular emotion, the mind that gets inspired, and so on, the mind of the poet, the mind that suffers is different from the mind that creates. So, at one stage, the poet or the artist experiences something. The poet or the artist is probably inspired by something. The poet or the artist is moved by something. But in the next stage, when that poet or artist creates a work of art, and it is not a simple transition from the moment of inspiration to the moment of creation. These two are at two different ends of the spectrum. The poet may experience something or be inspired, but it is not a direct translation into the work of art, but in the poet's mind, you have a lot of uh, reactions, the impression, that moment of inspiration, that object which inspired the poet will combine with the earlier impressions, whatever the poet has read so far, whatever the poet has gathered from the past, the works of the great writers, the works of the past. All of these will combine together, and then you have the creation of the work of art. That is why he says the mind that suffers or experiences is different from the mind that creates. So it is at this point that Eliot totally rejects the romantic conception of poetry. We are familiar with Wordsworth's famous definition of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions or feelings. And here, Eliot totally dismisses that kind of theory of the romantic expressive theory, the theory of self-expression. It is not the self of the poet that gets expressed in a work of art. It is a combination of a lot of impressions and objects and things. So, the experiences which are important to the poet as a person do not have much of a place in the finished work of art, in the poetry or in the work of art. And those that are quite important in the poet's work have actually nothing much to do with the poet's personality. So he rejects Wordsworth's theory of emotions being recollected in tranquility, and Eliot makes the very famous statement that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but in fact, an escape from personality. Even when he says that, poetry is an escape from personality, it does not mean that he rejects personality altogether. It is quite clearly stated by Eliot that it is only a person who has a personality and who is capable of feeling emotions, who's capable of feeling inspired and so on. Such a person alone will know what it means to escape from that personality and that emotion. And even as he rejects Wordsworth's concept of, the self-expression in poetry, one can think of a very close parallel between Eliot's conception of depersonalization and the Romantic poet John Keats's concept of negative capability. Keats defines negative capability as a, a kind of state of mind when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And the he says that this kind of negative capability, removing oneself from it, removing one's own beliefs and one's own, the facts and things like that, that is a necessary condition for successful composition. A willing submission to things as they are, rather than interpreting them as you understand them. That is what is negative capability. A willing submission to things as they are is a prerequisite to poetry. It is only then, only when you give up your uh, individual notions that a poet can get into a state of impartial freedom and range freely without being committed to any dead weight of a doctrine, any dead weight, that you hold on to, that uh, that will have a kind of obstructive uh, presence in the composition of poetry. So Keats's negative capability and Eliot's concept of depersonalization can in fact be seen to have a lot of similarities. It is in the last section of the essay that Eliot talks about the task of the poet to transmute personal feelings into something that has a much broader relevance, a universal significance. He concludes the essay by saying that very few know that there is an expression of significant emotion, emotion which has its life in the poem and not in the history of the poet. So it is the poem that is important and not the poet's own life. The emotion of art is impersonal. It's a very famous statement, significant statement made by Eliot. The emotion of art is impersonal, and the poet cannot reach this impersonality without surrendering himself wholly to the work to be done. And he is not likely to know what is to be done unless he lives in what is not merely the present, but the present moment of the past, unless he is conscious not of what is dead, but of what is already living. So what is already living? That is Eliot's concept of tradition. Tradition is not something that is dead, something that belongs to the past, something that is uh, useless or outdated. It is something that you can consider as already living, and you cannot but fail. You cannot just escape from that. It is something that will influence you a great deal. So uh, a poet may have individual talent and a personality of his own, but a work of art is not an expression of that personality alone. The work of art, the really good work of art, is one that takes this poet's moment of inspiration and experience and that personal feeling and then combines it with the past, that historical sense, the tradition, and as a reaction of that, you have the creation of something new, the work of art, out of which, the person in that work of art, the personality of the poet has been sublimated into something that has greater universal significance. It is not the poet's self that is getting expressed, but something that has a greater relevance. So it is in this context that we can also, having reached the end of the essay, we realize how significant, this essay would have been in the evolution of literary criticism. At a point when too much of significance was being attributed to the life of the poet, to the personality of the poet, to the experiences that the poet underwent, to the poet's own beliefs, and so on, here was a new voice which said that that is not what is significant in a work of art. The work of art has to be evaluated on its own terms, and it has to be measured not up to the poet's life, not in accordance with the poet's life, but it has to be measured against the whole tradition of which that poem and the poet is also a part. So that is how this essay is titled as Tradition and Individual Talent. Now, this essay and other similar works of literary criticism, similar essays of literary criticism by Eliot, to mention one or two, The Metaphysical Poets, Hamlet and His Problems. These are two of his other major works. There are many more, but all of these have contributed in many ways to give literary criticism a new direction altogether. During the middle of the 20th century, we have the heydays of what is known as new criticism. We will be discussing new criticism soon, but more than anything else, new criticism was something that upheld the sanctity of the text, not the background of the work, not the poet, not the political background. Nothing matters more than the text itself. So this tendency or this impetus to focus on the work of art, the literary text, the poem, the novel, the work of art, was something that the new critics did, partly inspired by Eliot's own essays, and among which Tradition and Individual Talent is a significant one. And in this context, one can also look at some of the other major contributions that Eliot made to the field of literary criticism, like this concept of depersonalization and the catalyst, poet's mind being the poet being something like a catalyst. We can think of terms like the unification of sensibility that he spoke about, and another term is objective correlative. Now, objective correlative is something that is prescribed in your course, in your syllabus, and we'll discuss that. But I can also make a mention of this famous term that he made with regard to the unification of sensibility. And it was in the essay on the metaphysical poets that Eliot made this reference to the unification of sensibility. According to him, poets like Donne, the metaphysical poets like Donne, in their works you can see a coming together, a unification of thought and feeling. This is a very positive thing that Eliot celebrates, the coming together of thought and feeling, the intellect and emotions. The ideal poetry is one where you have the coming together of the intellectual aspect, that is thought, and emotions or feeling. And as we progressed, as mankind became more and more civilized, one can see a gradual dissociation of sensibility setting in. The unified thought and feeling that you find as manifested so well in the poetry of the metaphysical poets seems to get more and more diminished, and by the time you reach the 20th century and the poetry, you can find this kind of fragmentation, a total dissociation of sensibility. Even in the romantic poets you have that dissociation of sensibility, and so that is another concept that Eliot has contributed to the field of literary criticism. But we'll talk about objective correlative, which is the term that you are expected to study. So what is objective correlative? And that is what we will see in the next slide. So the objective correlative, as Eliot defines it, is an image, a situation, or an object or action that features in a work of art which evokes a particular emotion from the reader. The writer does not have to state that emotion, but with the use of certain images, sometimes a kind of action, sometimes a situation, the writer can evoke in the audience, can inspire in the audience or the reader the same kind of emotion. And this kind of objective correlative is, it is directly connected to Eliot's concept of the depersonalization and the filtering out of the personality of the poet. The poet does not come in the way and explain to the reader, but the poet uses certain images, words, situations, action, and so on. Poet or any artist for that matter. It could be a playwright, it could be a painter, it could be a filmmaker, it could be a novelist, using situations, words, images, concepts, and so on, which can evoke a like response in the audience, the reader, the viewer, and the one who perceives that work of art. Now, it is this as a term, objective correlative is something that we associate with T.S. Eliot, and he was the one who made it famous. He used it. He talked about this in a very famous essay of his called Hamlet and His Problems, which was published in the year 1919. But Eliot was by no means the first person to use this phrase. In fact, it was first used by a painter as early as the year 1850 in the 19th century. This painter, Washington Allston, in his lectures on art, he talked about the importance of objective correlative to suggest the relation between the mind and the external world. So it was in the context of paintings that he spoke about that, painting things in a particular way in order to capture some feelings in the mind of the viewers of the painting. And this notion of the objective correlative was further enlarged by the writer, the philosopher George Santayana in Interpretations of Poetry and Religion in the year 1900, where he suggested that correlative objects could not only express a poet's feeling, but also evoke it. And it is this idea that Eliot takes forward in his discussion on the play Hamlet. The term objective correlative was introduced by T.S. Eliot in the essay Hamlet and His Problems. He uses this term to describe, I'm quoting from this essay, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion. The emotion that the poet himself or herself feels, and hopes to evoke in the reader. In other words, there must be a strong connection between the emotion that the poet is trying to convey, to express, and an image, an object, or a situation in that work of art which should help to convey that emotion to the reader. So the poet may have experienced a particular moment of inspiration, he or she may have been moved by something, and according to Eliot, if the same feeling, the same emotion, that same inspiration, and that emotion that the poet feels, if he or she wants to evoke the same kind of feeling in the reader, then ideally it can be used through the use of some such image, object, or situation. And when the reader perceives that, when the reader reads that or sees that or watches that, it will evoke the same response and emotion in the reader. This is T.S. Eliot's conception of the objective correlative. It's very clearly associated with the Imagist movement, which was very powerful at the time that T.S. Eliot himself was active in the literary field. It upheld the use of images in literary works. So, as we have already mentioned, it was in his discussion of the play Hamlet, in the essay called Hamlet and His Problems, that Eliot uses this term. And he believes that, or Eliot states very emphatically that Hamlet is a kind of artistic failure. Why? Because Shakespeare, according to Eliot, is unable um, to move the audience to feel exactly like Prince Hamlet. Like you have a lot of emotional outpouring coming from Hamlet, but it remains at that level. Eliot believes that the audience does not feel the same kind of emotional intensity. You just watch it as a play. You observe this person in deep trouble. Hamlet is torn between life and death. Hamlet is unable to take decisions. He keeps putting off things and so on. But as the audience, according to Eliot, we just watch it and we do not feel that emotional intensity that Hamlet himself was going through. So he believed that Hamlet's intense emotions overwhelmed the author's attempts to express them through an objective correlative. There is no such image or object or situation that Shakespeare uses. You have emotions, but that objective correlative, that to which you can relate, that is not there. So Eliot felt that Shakespeare was unable to provoke the audience to feel like Prince Hamlet, and he could only inadequately describe his emotional state through the play's dialogue. So it is thus that he considers Hamlet to be an artistic failure. It does not move the audience, or it does not evoke in the audience the same feeling that Hamlet, the character, would have gone through. So Eliot considers Hamlet to be an artistic failure because of its inability to evoke in the audience the same kind of emotional intensity, emotional disturbance that Hamlet feels. Hamlet's emotions and his disturbed state of mind are conveyed through his dialogues, the long soliloquies, those long speeches that he makes at different stages in the play. On the other hand, according to Eliot, a play like Macbeth is more of an artistic success because it has in it objective correlatives that express the disturbed states of mind of both Lord Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And he quotes as an example of Lady Macbeth's disturbed state of mind, her sleepwalking scene. You have that situation which, more than any line of dialogue that she utters, can evoke in the audience almost the same kind of feeling, that disturbed state of mind, that sense of guilt hanging heavy in her mind. So in her sleepwalking scene, in that scene where she is obsessed about washing her hands, feeling that it is smeared, her hands, fearing that the hands are smeared with the blood of murder and so on. These situations are objective correlatives, according to Eliot, which can evoke a similar response in the audience.